Welcome, welcome. Good to see you all here tonight. Thank you. I just want to have a few little remarks before I introduce Peighton. We have our annual report is available, and if you did not get it in the mail, feel free to pick up a copy at the back table before you go in the elevator. And it talks all about the things that we did last year, including this wonderful lecture series, which tonight's lecture is part of the John D. Owen Jr. History Lecture Series. Our next month on December 6th at 5:30 p.m., please join us for a book signing and remarks by Travis McDonald. Many of you may know Travis's name. He's an architectural historian. He was at Poplar Forest for many, many years, and he will speak about his new book on Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. So that's December 6th at 5:30 p.m. here at the library. And then we do take a little bit of a break in the history lecture series for the holidays, and we come back in March. And that will be, our next lecture in the series will be Wednesday, March 13th. And T.J. Anderson III is going to share the story of his great-grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Anderson, who was one of the first African Americans to serve on the Lynchburg City Council, and that was in the 1880s. So I hope you can join us for that. Our website is currently under construction, so you will find information about programs and library events on our Facebook page, and I encourage you to check that out. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Peighton Young, who is with us this evening to speak on Black American life at Patrick Henry's Red Hill Plantation. Peighton is a public historian, genealogist, and fourth-year PhD candidate at the College of William and Mary. So she had 4 years. So you've gone through a lot already, and you're near the end.
2 years to go.
2 years to go. So Peighton currently works as a historian, genealogist, and research advisory council member for Patrick Henry's Red Hill Plantation in Brookneal. She is also the co-chair and public representative of the Descendants Council of Greater Richmond, Virginia, an organization that advocates for the protection and preservation of historic Black cemeteries in the Richmond metro area. Specializing in the history of the African American experience, Peighton uses their platform to support historical institutions and public projects that elevate the Black community voices across Virginia and beyond. Peighton is going to speak about 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll then have a Q&A afterwards. So welcome, Peighton.
Should we move closer over here so I can hear better? Can you do that?
Oh, can everybody hear me fine? Okay, cool. So first of all, I want to just thank everybody for being here this evening. This is my first time speaking at this library, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. This presentation is all about our Black History and Descendant Engagement Program at Patrick Henry's Red Hill Plantation, which is located in Brookneal. And if you haven't visited before, and I really hope that you do, we're located just a little less than an hour southeast of Lynchburg, right down 501. So what I would like to do with my presentation is discuss why we started our Black History project, take you through the history of Black life at Red Hill, explain our descendant community-based approach to historical research and education, and then end things by talking about our current Black community history projects and programs that you can visit both anytime and annually. So our project began in 2018 when Red Hill applied for and received a grant to reacquire 77 acres of land, once part of the plantation, that had come under the control of a logging company during the mid-20th century. That 77 acres included a section of Red Hill called the Quarter Place, which is where the majority of the enslaved population and post-slavery Black community lived and labored for most of the plantation's history. In 2019, Longwood University's field school, led by Dr. Brian Bates, conducted an archaeological study and mapping project at Quarter Place. Their research uncovered a number of archaeological findings, most notably including 147 graves of the slavery and post-emancipation Black community who once called Quarter Place their home. As Brian Bates and his students were making Red Hill aware of the potential scope of Black history that could be studied, around the same time a number of descendants of people who were enslaved at Red Hill began approaching staff looking for information about their ancestors' lives and experiences on the plantation. Excuse me. And because of these developments, it became very clear that Red Hill needed to develop a research and descendant engagement process that was specifically tailored to studying the history of Black life on site, sharing that information with descendants in accessible ways, and developing Black historical educational programs that could be provided to visitors. And I was brought in during 2020 to help with this process. So for almost 4 years now, I have been researching the lives and experiences of the Black community who lived and labored at Red Hill and other closely related Henry family historical sites, both during slavery and after emancipation. Much of my work is particularly focused on helping to find the names of the people who are buried at Quarter Place Cemetery, identify living descendants of the enslaved and post-emancipation Black community, and ultimately work to create real space for those descendants to contribute to how we teach the history of their ancestors to the public. Red Hill became a publicly accessible historical site in 1944 with the establishment of the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting research and the creation of educational programs about the life and legacy of Patrick Henry. Teaching visitors about Patrick Henry's historical and cultural significance as a founding father has been central to Red Hill's public-facing life. While Red Hill has no doubt been an important educational resource for those who want to learn more about Henry and his family, our site's hyper-focus on his life and career has been done at the expense of researching and educating visitors about the enslaved community and their descendants, whose lives have just as much historical importance and value as Patrick Henry's. For decades, Red Hill has been guilty of at times characterizing the people that Patrick Henry and his family enslaved as being content in their condition of bondage. At other times, site programs excluded Black people's experiences from interpretation and education plans altogether. This has had tremendous consequences. It kept visitors from accessing an honest portrayal of the history of slavery at Red Hill, while also keeping both descendants and members of the public from learning about how local African Americans and their experiences helped to shape the history of this plantation and the wider Brookneal community. To address these issues, we work in collaboration with descendants and local residents to develop a more community-centered approach to our research, descendant engagement, and education processes that properly records and teaches visitors about the true history of Black life at Red Hill. We do this to ensure that the history of the Black experience never becomes lost to public memory again. To further these goals with consent from descendants and local community members, we utilize their oral histories and other materials that they share with us to build and improve our Black history educational program so that we can guarantee that the history of the Black community at Red Hill and other related sites is taught in an honest, accurate, and accessible way. At the same time, it is our goal to make available all the tools that we have at our disposal to help descendant families in the wider local African American community preserve their histories in ways that they find most helpful. Making sure that descendants are included in every part of our programmatic development is an incredibly important part of how we, as representatives of a plantation museum site, have sought to facilitate positive changes in our relationship with the descendant community and the broader African American community. Much of the material I'll be talking about this evening comes from descendants who have so graciously shared their family histories with me and Red Hill staff over the past 4 years. African American history at Red Hill is incredibly rich and complex, and it extends far beyond the boundary lines of this plantation. It is necessary to understand that the human history of a plantation is very rarely ever isolated to that plantation. It often stretches to many different towns, cities, counties, and states, and often encompasses the experiences of an incredible number of people. So too is the case with Red Hill, whose history spans the lives of hundreds of enslaved people who lived in more than half a dozen counties in Virginia alone, as well as numerous properties in states across the country. I have traced descendants of Red Hill's slavery and post-slavery black community to as far north as Boston, Massachusetts, as far south as Florida, and as far west as Texas. And over time, as we continue to do this research, we find that the circle of descendants is constantly expanding and crisscrossing with families throughout Southside Virginia and beyond. And in order to begin to really unpack this wide scope of African American experience that we are trying to record and preserve with our work, I want to return to my earlier mention of Quarter Place and further explain its centrality to black life at Red Hill and the genealogical work that I've been doing with descendant families. Quarter Place, which is located about a quarter of a mile from Patrick Henry's main home, was the space where the enslaved and post-emancipation black community lived and labored for more than 150 years. Most of them labored in farming and tobacco processing, while others worked in the domestic sphere. Quarter Place is also home to one of the most well-preserved historic black cemeteries in Virginia. It is where 147 African American people were buried between 1794 and 1937. 147 of those graves are marked with either a headstone, a footstone, or both, while some have no surviving marker at all. The majority of these graves have no names or dates on them. Only one grave belonging to Matilda Pinnell, who was one of the last children to be enslaved at Red Hill, has a traditional burial stone with her name and age at the time of her death carved into it. To date, we've been able to identify 51 names of the 147 people who were buried at the Quarter Place Cemetery, so we're just over a third. Quarter Place is particularly special because its cemetery lies undisturbed. It is the final resting place of around 6 or 7 generations of black Brookneal families and community members. It is a tangible space for descendants of those enslaved at Red Hill and or those who resided at Red Hill after the Civil War to physically and emotionally engage with the land. I often like to refer to Quarter Place as a historical and cultural home base. And this is because no matter how long their relative was enslaved on site or whether they were sold or moved to a different county or state by one of Patrick Henry's descendants, the existence of Quarter Place creates the opportunity for descendants to access a physical space that was part of their ancestors' past. In more recent years, it's become a gathering place for descendants to honor their families' legacies. So as I'm speaking, I want you to picture Quarter Place not only as a cemetery, but as a place intentionally created by enslaved people and preserved through the generations by their descendants. And right now, I'd like to share some of their lives and legacies with you. In 1794, Patrick Henry purchased the Red Hill Plantation, where he spent the last 5 years of his life. Before moving to Brookneal, however, Henry lived at a number of properties spread throughout central, Tidewater, and Southside Virginia. And between the start of his political career around 1765 and the beginning of his retirement in Charlotte County in 1794, he lived in 8 different homes located in Louisa County, Hanover County, Richmond, Chesterfield County, Williamsburg, Henry County, Prince Edward County, and Campbell County. That's obviously a lot of places, but where he lived over that near 20-year time span matters because all that constant movement meant that the people he enslaved and the families those enslaved people would create over time also moved with him. Therefore, the majority of the people he enslaved at Red Hill were not actually born there, but were instead born in other properties in other towns and cities across Virginia and were brought there by Henry and his family. It is these early generations of enslaved people that built what we know today as the Quarter Place community. By the time of Patrick Henry's death in June of 1799, he had been enslaving 67 people at Red Hill, a mixture of children, teenagers, adults, elderly men, and women. In his estate inventory recorded that summer, 9 fragmented enslaved families were documented there. The condition of fragmentation, of being separated, is an extremely important part of their life experiences. These families were Peg and her children Shadrach, Nancy, Pleasant, Jesse, Reuben, and Letty, Daphne and her sons Tim and Ned, Millie and her son Joe, Pretty and her sons Jack White, Harrison, and Coleman, Nell and her son Billy, Beck and her children, Robin, Peg, and Dinah, Mary and her children, Phil, Sally, Abby, Gib, and Squire. Polly and her children, Abraham, Pressy, Polly, and Deesey. And Anarchy and her children, Violet, Fanny, Zebulon, and Lewis. And as I'm sure you've noticed, I didn't mention any of the names of the fathers or husbands of these families. And that is because while we know that men such as Jesse, Daniel, Cato, Joe, and 8 others were all enslaved at Red Hill during this time, they were not recorded alongside their families. They were documented separately. Equally as poignant are the numbers of elderly people like Dinah and Elsie who were recorded alone in the inventory, and the 12 children who aren't listed alongside their mothers at all, suggesting that they may have been enslaved together with other relatives, or may have lost their parents at an early age due to their death or sale. While any of these circumstances may have affected the lives of the people enslaved here, the institution of slavery constantly disrupted the stability of the nuclear family at Red Hill. It made it extremely difficult to keep those family ties together over time. And although enslaved people tried to build family and community bonds within this system of bondage, the institution of slavery was not designed to protect black families. And the consequences of this fact would be felt for generations to come. After Henry's death, Red Hill's enslaved community experienced family separation on a very large scale. By 1802, the enslaved population at Red Hill had grown to 69 people due to the births of 2 children named Abraham and Molly. In his last will and testament, Patrick Henry ordered that his widow, Dorothea Henry, be given ownership of Red Hill, along with 20 enslaved people of her choosing from his estate. He also instructed that Dorothea be given the ability to divide the other 49 enslaved people amongst the 11 children she and Patrick Henry had together. Over the next 40 years, those 49 enslaved people, along with their children, were scattered amongst Dorothea and Patrick Henry's children and grandchildren, some of whom resided in and around Charlotte County, Virginia, while others had moved to different states entirely. In 1802, Dorothea Henry married Judge Edmund Winston and moved to his plantation called Hunting Tower, or sometimes called Hunting Tor, in Buckingham County, Virginia, where she took the 20 enslaved people I mentioned earlier, which were all a mix of men, women, and 10 children. Amongst these were 4 families, Peg and her 6 children, Shadrach, Nancy, Jesse, Reuben, Pleasant, and Letty, Daphne and only one of her sons, a boy named Ned, Pretty and her sons, Jack, White, Harrison, and Coleman, all of whom I mentioned earlier, and a man named Peter and his wife, Lucy. Also amongst the 20 enslaved people she took with her were 4 men named Jesse, Caesar, Micaiah, and Isaac. Between 1802 and 1818, Dorothea Henry Winston lived in Buckingham County and later moved to Lynchburg. During that time, the Winstons enslaved at least 48 people, many of whom were amongst the 20 that she had originally taken from Red Hill 8 years before, while others were likely their spouses and children, along with people originally enslaved by Edmund Winston himself prior to his marriage to Dorothea Henry. This image, and so this image right here that I'm referencing is the Buckingham County Census for 1810, and it's the only surviving record that I could find listing any enslaved people at Hunting Tower while Judge Winston and his wife lived there. His entry is 7th from the top right here. You can see the 48 people right there. Having this documented all is very significant because a few years ago I actually called the Buckingham County Clerk's office to discuss visiting their records room to look for more information about slavery at Hunting Tower. And I was told that if I was looking for anything prior to 1869, I'd be lucky to find anything at all because the courthouse burned down during the Civil Wars, thus burning the majority of the records with it. So finding this 1810 census was extremely fortunate. And I mention this issue because the courthouse fires that took place during the Civil War and at other points in Virginia's early history is one of the really big reasons why doing genealogical research for African American families looking to learn more about their relatives before the late 19th century can be extremely difficult. Because of the destruction of these records, it's currently unclear how long the Winstons lived at Hunting Tower. and what slavery was like there. We also don't know exactly when or why they moved to Lynchburg. Still, we do know that after Judge Winston died in 1818, his widow moved herself and the people she enslaved to her daughter Sarah Butler Henry's home, called the Seven Islands Plantation, which is in Halifax County, Virginia. And Dorothea Henry stayed at Seven Islands until her death in 1831. The following year, in accordance with her will, Dorothea Henry Winston formally gave the Red Hill Plantation to two of her sons, John Henry and Edward Winston Henry, both of whom had been living at Red Hill since about 1815. And John and Edward had already started families of their own years before their mother's death, and the brothers had already split the land between themselves by 1820, with John Henry's half becoming Red Hill as we know it today, and Edward Henry's half becoming the neighboring plantation, Winston-on-the-Stanton. This division of property is shown in this Charlotte County census record on the right from 1820. And so Dorothea's will really just seems to kind of put the legal stamp on the land being divided between those two brothers. Before Dorothea Henry died, she brought back a small number of enslaved people that she had taken from Red Hill and brought with her to Hunting Tower back in 1802. This was Critty and two of her sons, Harrison and Jack White. It is unclear if Critty's son Coleman was left in Buckingham County, Lynchburg, Seven Islands, sold away, or had died before his mother and brothers were brought back to Brookneal. Jack White was brought back to Red Hill by 1815, but disappears from Red Hill's records after that point. Critty and Harrison appear to have been the only members of their family enslaved by John Henry at Red Hill by the mid-19th century. Critty is generally interpreted as the enslaved cook there, while Harrison was the enslaved coachman. In the 1850s, Critty died around the age of 105, according to the Charlotte County mortality schedule for that decade. And Harrison eventually married an enslaved woman named Millie and continued to be enslaved there until the end of the Civil War. He remained at Red Hill after emancipation and lived there until his death, which is said to have happened sometime between 1905 and 1907, also making him just over 100 years old at the time of his death as well. Many of the people who were enslaved at Patrick Henry's Red Hill continued to remain on the property enslaved by his son once he took over the plantation. This was the case for people like Fox, Pricey, and a few others who had been enslaved there since they were very young children during the late 18th century. Still, not everyone who was enslaved at Red Hill after 1820 was born at Red Hill or brought there as a child during Patrick Henry's lifetime. Some people were purchased through the slave trade. During the early 1840s, John Henry purchased enslaved people from his older brother, Alexander Spotswood Henry, in Campbell County. Alexander Spotswood Henry actually made at least part of his career by selling enslaved people out of several counties in Southside Virginia. I found that he sold at least somewhere between 25 and 30 people to enslavers in Charlotte County, Campbell County, Bedford County, and Botetourt County. But it's likely that he sold more people during his lifetime. At least one of those sales was advertised in the Lynchburg, Virginia newspaper shown here. We know that in 1840 and 1841, John Henry bought at least 6 people from his brother in Campbell County. Their names were Shadrach, Louisa, Nancy, another person named Nancy, Sally, and Kate. It is likely that John Henry bought more people during his lifetime as well, but more research on that issue is still ongoing. Another person whom Alexander Spotswood Henry may have sold out of state was a man named James Henry Sr., who was sold to John Bratton in Winsboro, South Carolina, sometime around 1850. James's son, James Henry Jr., was interviewed in the 1930s for the WPA project. And if you're not familiar with the WPA project, during the Great Depression and the early years of World War II, the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, was established as a New Deal-era program under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It provided people with jobs in public works projects during the late 1930s and early 1940s. Recording oral histories from formerly enslaved people in particular is one of the project's biggest claims to fame. And as part of this project, James Henry Jr. spoke about how his father, James Sr., was bought and sold by a member of the Henry family as a young adult. In that interview, James Jr. said that his father was, quote, bought by the Patrick Henry family of Virginia, and that was, quote, the reason why Pappy and us took that name after freedom. This information was provided to us by three of James Jr. and James Sr.'s descendants. James Jr.'s WPA narrative can be found on the Library of Congress website. Whether through the purchases engaged in by John Henry or the generations of enslaved people who continued to build their families at Red Hill through the early to mid-19th century, the enslaved population on the plantation steadily continued to increase. By 1860, John Henry was enslaving 44 people at Red Hill, aged between 2 and 60 years old. 5 years later, at the end of the Civil War, that number had risen to 54. Pictured here is a list that John Henry made of the 54 people who were still enslaved at Red Hill at the time of the Confederate surrender in April of 1865. You can see a copy of this down at Quarter Place if you visit. This list is incredibly powerful because it is the last document that records any of them as being enslaved. The majority of it is actually organized by family groups and households, which shows that John Henry may have actually went cabin to cabin to write it. This list also includes a few people who were enslaved by Patrick Henry as very young children, including Violet Henry, who is, I could actually just walk over, right here. A little too short, but fourth from the top. Right there. She was born around 1798 or 1799, and she was recorded in Patrick Henry's estate inventory, if you remember from a little bit earlier in the talk, with her mother Anarchy and her 2 brothers and her sister. Violet would spend the rest of her life at Red Hill caring for her family members and some of the children in the Quarter Place community. She died sometime between 1880 and 1900 and was buried at the Quarter Place Cemetery. The experiences of Violet Henry, along with the other 53 people and their descendants in the years following emancipation, are a testament to their fortitude and determination to build new lives for themselves, their families, and their community after slavery. And I want to share one of those stories with you right now, but to do so, I actually need to take you guys all the way back to the beginning when I talked about Peg and her 6 children, all of whom were brought to Red Hill by Patrick Henry in 1794, then taken to Hunting Tower in 1802 by Patrick Henry's widow when she remarried that year. Then they were taken to Seven Islands Plantation in Halifax County, Virginia in 1818, where they stayed until Dorothea Henry Winston's death in 1831. But that isn't the end of their story. While the fates of most of Peg's family members are largely unknown, we do know that her son Pleasant remained enslaved at Seven Islands until 1865, and that he likely continued to live on the grounds of that plantation for the rest of his life. Pleasant was recorded in Sarah Butler Henry's 1857 Last Will and Testament, along with 2 other men whom I talked about earlier, Ned and Abram, who were all originally enslaved at Red Hill as children and were later brought to Seven Islands from Hunting Tower by Dorothea Henry Winston 39 years before. None of Pleasant's brothers and sisters were recorded in Sarah Butler Henry's will, which suggests that they were either sold, freed, had passed away, or ran away years before. It is likely that by this time in Pleasant's life, when he was becoming an elderly man, Ned and Abram were his only living connections to Red Hill and the enslaved community he spent so much of his childhood a part of. When Sarah Butler Henry died, Pleasant was passed down to her son Patrick Henry Scott, who took over the ownership of Seven Islands. In that 1860 slave schedule, there were only 3 enslaved men from Seven Islands who were listed as being around the ages of 60 and 70 years old. Through my research, I could be quite confident in saying that those men were likely Ned, who was in his 60s, Abram, who was about 70, and Pleasant, who was about 74 at that time. If we look back at Patrick Henry's 1799 and 1802 estate inventories, we'll find that the estimated age ranges those documents record correspond pretty perfectly to how old Ned, Abram, and Pleasant would have been in 1860. The last existing record that I could find for Pleasant, who took his enslaver's surname of Scott after the Civil War, was in the Halifax County mortality schedule. This is the only county document that I've ever seen that has Pleasant's full name in it, Pleasant Scott. According to that record, he died of old age in Stanton Township in Halifax County in December of 1869 at the age of 83. His entry is third from the bottom in this image. At the time of his death, Pleasant was recorded as having been a farm laborer, and he was also a widower. We don't know what his wife's name was, and because Pleasant didn't live long enough to be included in the 1870 census, we don't presently know if he had any children or if he lived with relatives around the time of his death. But that all said, Pleasant lived to see freedom, and he does have family that are still living today. And I know that because I've had the privilege of meeting them. And their names are Janet Morgan and Sharon Brooks from Delaware and New York City, respectively. They're the fourth great-granddaughters of Letty, Pleasant's youngest sister. They both came to visit Red Hill and Quarter Place for the very first time in 2021 at our first Quarter Place consecration ceremony. And my reason for telling you this story is to really drive home the fact that these families still exist and their experiences are such an incredibly important part of Virginia's African American history, Brookneal's community history, and Red Hill's history. Their lives and legacies matter. In the decades following emancipation, a significant number of formerly enslaved people and their families continued to live at and around Red Hill. While many still engaged in tobacco farming and domestic labor, either on-site or on neighboring farms and plantations, by the late 19th century, many started to branch out, move, and pursue lives outside of Red Hill. People like Reuben Richard Henry, for example, who was enslaved at Red Hill as a child with his mother Susan. After emancipation, he started a very large family, moved to West Virginia to become a coal miner like many people did who came from Red Hill after 1865. Reuben eventually moved back to Virginia, settled in Bluefield, where he became a very well-loved pastor. And there are a lot of newspaper articles about the community works that he did. He was particularly well known for building churches, and his family is still very proud of that to this day. Pleasant Scott's youngest sister, Letty Henry Banks, also moved away from the Henry family properties in her later life. She moved to Pittsylvania County, Virginia after slavery, where she married a man named Orange Banks and lived with him and her grandchildren until she passed away in 1871, around the age of 90. At the same time, there were also many people who continued to spend much of their lives at Quarter Place or close by after 1865. People such as Ludwell Brown, who was also enslaved at Red Hill as a child. When he was a teenager, he became Thomas Stanhope Henry's enslaved field servant and supply runner during the Civil War. And after emancipation, he moved to Campbell County and worked as a postman. Throughout his adult life, he was a well-respected figure of the Brookneal and Falling River Black communities, oftentimes being affectionately called Uncle Lud. He died in 1937, around 90 years old. Ludwell is, to date, the latest burial that we know of at Quarter Place so far. There are also families like those of George and Louisa Henry, Matilda and Harry Pennell, whose legacies still live on through their many descendants who live as close by as literally down the road from Red Hill to as far away as New York City. There are families like those of the Henrys, Banners, Dowells, Giles, Moores, and so many others who all have people buried at the Quarter Place Cemetery. And there are the many families who are part of the Mount Calvary Baptist, Spring Hill Baptist, and other local churches whose founding congregations can be traced back to the enslaved communities at Red Hill and other plantations in the local area. Other members of the African American community came to live and work at Red Hill during the early 20th century as well. Walter Cook, pictured here on the far right, and Alonzo Moore were both caretakers of Red Hill during the early 20th century and were the patriarchs of large enduring families who still live in that area, as well as all around the country today. Alonzo Moore and his family sharecropped at Red Hill for years, and his children still share stories of that time. And if you go to our website, you can find an oral history from his son Floyd Moore, who spoke about his experiences sharecropping there as a child. And thus far, I've been able to create biographies for 13 families who were either enslaved here, lived here after 1865, or were buried here. And I still have very, very many more to write. Our work of trying to research and preserve these histories is still a work in progress. It's a process of reconstruction, of building pictures of real people whose lives and experiences are too often buried in census data and courthouse records. And sometimes you just can't find that information at all without connecting with descendants. So, together with descendants, we work to put those puzzle pieces back together so we can properly honor how each and every African American person who walked these grounds contributed to the history of this community. For these reasons, building strong and lasting relationships with the descendant community as well as the local community has been a critical part of our work. To ensure our success, we've developed a descendant engagement process that can address descendant needs and expectations as we expand our research and genealogical work. To this end, we provide free genealogical and historical research services to descendants and local residents who are interested in learning more about Black history in relation to Red Hill or other related Henry family sites. The idea behind this is to make every resource that we have accessible to the community, as well as to make certain that we avoid creating situations where we're asking people to share their family histories without us giving them anything in return. Another core part of our work also involves guiding descendants through the process of connecting or reconnecting with the spaces that their ancestors resided in while enslaved. This at times means physically taking descendants through Red Hill and Quarter Place for the first time, as well as being a shoulder to cry on or a person to vent to as they work through the personal process of contending with the challenging experiences that their ancestors faced during and after slavery. At other times, it means spending time with families and participating in the ways they choose to honor their ancestries. So for example, these images right here are from a descendant family reunion we hosted at Red Hill this past July. During that time, the family invited myself, as well as my colleague Keisha Folks, who is our Director of Community Engagement, to attend their church services, as well as walk the grounds of Winston, what used to be Winston on the Stanton, where some of their ancestors once lived and are still buried in. And it was an incredible experience to share this time with them. And I say all that to say that effective descendant engagement and community engagement requires that we be present, not just as history or museum professionals, but as people and members of the community that we serve. Together in partnership with the descendant community and local residents, we develop strategies to preserve their histories in ways that they find most meaningful to them. Since beginning this project, we have come to understand Red Hill and Quarter Place in particular as sites of pilgrimage for descendants to honor the legacies of those who were enslaved here and those who continue to live here after emancipation. And at the same time, for members of the wider African American community who aren't related to people who were enslaved at Red Hill and don't have access to the spaces their families were once enslaved on, Quarter Place has become a site to honor the legacies of Black enslaved ancestors in a more universal manner, a place to reflect upon their experiences and revere the many ways that they sought to rebuild their lives after slavery. As we keep in mind the different ways these spaces serve our community, we've created programs and memorial events designed to celebrate these legacies. In June 2021, we held our first Quarter Place consecration event, where two pastors from Mount Calvary Baptist Church and Spring Hill Baptist Church led a ceremony to honor those buried at the Quarter Place Cemetery. We had more than 200 attendees. And descendants who attended came from as close by as just down the road from Red Hill to as far away as Delaware, Ohio, New York, and West Virginia. As of last year, we host an annual Quarter Place tribute. And this year we did our second. This is a free event where we invite descendants and members of the public to come and hear talks about the history of Black life at Red Hill, listen to talks provided by descendant speakers, share music, food, and dance programs provided by community members, as well as visit Red Hill's grounds. These events are held each fall, and so far they've been held in October. This past July, we hosted, as I mentioned before, the Yule Moore Price Family Reunion, which is the first Black descendant family reunion we've hosted here since our project began. Personally, it was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had, and this is also in part because a cousin of mine is a descendant of people both enslaved at Winston-on-the-Stanton and at Red Hill. So it was kind of a nice way to kind of get the family together. Definitely expanding my own family as well. So for this gathering, we created talks and programs specifically geared towards sharing information about their family's history at Red Hill and related properties that their ancestors have a connection to. Most recently, we opened the Price of Chains and Slavery exhibition, an exhibition created by our Director of Preservation, Cody Youngblood, who is sitting right there, who is the tallest dude in the room, I feel like, so it's hard to miss him. Created that in collaboration with myself, historian Mark Couvillon, and a number of descendants who have shared their families' histories with us. The exhibition details the history of slavery and post-slavery Black life at Red Hill and utilizes many artifacts to tell their stories, including photos and newspaper articles provided by descendants. And I definitely encourage you to come and visit the exhibition and join us for one of our tribute events next year. I want to conclude by saying that above anything else, researching the history of the Black experience at Red Hill has been a deeply collaborative process between myself, my colleagues, the local community, and each descendant who has honored us with the opportunity to record their family histories or do research on their behalf in order to broaden both ours and their personal understandings of their ancestries. We still have a lot of work to do, and we're always working to improve our Black historical education and public programs. We are grateful to the descendants and community members who have made and continue to make all of this possible for us. Thank you so much for having me.
So, questions? Peyton, I'm curious about your own personal journey towards doing genealogy and history. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I came from a family who really is, we're all history buffs. It's part of the reason why Lisa fits in with us so well. Who's a descendant of Red Hill as well, and my cousin. But I got started in a professional way with Preservation Virginia, which owns 6 historical sites around Virginia, including Patrick Henry Scotchtown at Hanover, if you're familiar with it. I worked as a site historian and genealogist at their Bacon's Castle site in Surrey. And during that time, a lot of the work we did was starting their oral history project as well as their descendant engagement project. And basically during that time, I was talking to my mom on the phone, and she was like, "Why don't you do this for us? You're doing it for everybody else. Why don't you do this for us?" I'm like, "It's a fair question. It's a fair question." So and at the time when I started doing that, I think I'd been living in Richmond for about 7 years. And I was living, if you're familiar with Richmond, I was living in the Jackson Ward area at the time. I was living on St. James Street, 507 St. James Street to be specific. And so I started looking at my family's genealogy because I knew that my grandmother's family in part came from Richmond. And as I was looking, I found the burial record for my 3rd great-grandfather, whose name was John Williams Jefferson. And they also lived in the Jackson Ward area, but towards the edge, kind of closer to the north side. And I found out that at the time he died, his entire family was living at 1400 St. James Street, so right down the street. I could literally walk to where he was at. The house doesn't exist, but the lot is still there. And I found out that he's buried at the Woodland Cemetery, which is kind of on the outskirts of Richmond City proper. And I think what's particularly powerful about that situation is that he doesn't have a headstone, and we cannot find his grave, which is an issue that plagues historic Black cemeteries in Richmond as well as other parts of the state. And so we're still looking to this day, although I found his burial card, so we're kind of, getting a bit closer. But those kinds of experiences, I think they brought me in initially, but also realizing that other people had similar issues with trying to find their relatives or find more information about their relatives is what brought me into it. And I've found, incidentally, that I've been able to help other people a lot more than I have been able to my own family. And so reconciling that is still a bit challenging. But that's how I got it.
I have a question. You mentioned earlier when you talked about the fact that many of the burial sites have no marker. How do you deal with that issue? Can you get any further with that? DNA analysis? Anything like that? You determine who the person is?
So at this time, we haven't excavated graves or anything like that. And while staff is here, I don't believe that's something we plan to do. Yeah. But what we have tried to do at this point is figure out who is actually buried there. We've used a variety of different kinds of records, from Virginia Health Department records, sometimes just oral histories. There were a few people who actually just came over the summer who were able to tell us how and why their family member was buried at Quarter Place during the early 20th century. So we're trying to reconstruct it in that way. What I think is also interesting is if you go and visit Mount Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery or Spring Hill Cemetery, you can actually see similar types of unmarked stones. And you can see that they start to get a bit more polished over time. Both of those churches, I believe, were started in the 1880s, so in the 1880s. But you can see the variations start to get polished a little bit more over time. And I think what is also interesting about Quarter Place is that I don't doubt personally that there are probably kind of family bubbles that are plots more formally that are existing there. But I think it's more so just trying to kind of illustrate a picture of that existing rather than saying this is where this person is or this one, whatever. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Ramona in the back first, and she
Yeah.
raised her hand first.
Did I hear you say the word Shadrach? Shadrach? Tell me about Shadrach. Did you say that word, Shadrach?
Yes. So what I know about Shadrach thus far, and I mean, we don't really know too much about Shadrach's life aside from the fact that he was the oldest son of Peg, and that he was enslaved, I believe, in the domestic bubble at Red Hill. But beyond that, I don't have too much information about him, unfortunately, about his family life or generations after, unfortunately.
My question is, when you're looking at some of the slave records of Mr. Henry, did it include where he purchased those enslaved individuals from?
Unfortunately, no. There are a handful of records that are from, I think there are one or two in Campbell County and Charlotte County, one in Amelia County, I believe, and then might be just the three that have names of people that he's hired who have come to work at different properties where he was, but no formal sales records that I've found thus far for Red Hill.
And what about the reverse, in terms of who he sold it to? Was there any mention of that in any of the records at all?
Not that I found. I found more for his two sons. So in the situation of having the newspaper clipping in that situation, as well as we go to the county court in Rustburg, for example, I still have to sift through them because I'm positive there are more, I just need to find them. But if you go in the deeds, the county deed books, which are like this thick, some of them have indices and most of them don't, so it's,
Right.
it's a day, a good day spent to do that. But going through those records, I have found some of the deeds of sale for people that John has purchased and brought to Red Hill. And so I found 6 thus far, and one of those people, Louisa, may be George Henry's wife. It's possible. but more information is going to be needed to better flesh out, how she, what her life was, how she got there, and from whom she was sold from originally.
Thank you.
So, I know you are attending William and Mary at the moment. I did that many, many, many years ago. But I wondered where else you studied to get to this point.
Well, honestly, it's kind of an odd road. an odd road.
You can start with high school.
Well, I went to high school in Woodbridge, in Northern Virginia, in Lake Ridge. It's 20 minutes outside D.C. I got my bachelor's degree in art history at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University. I still study media culture. It's actually what I do outside of this bubble. It's kind of one foot in the early republic, and then one foot is an extreme modernist. It's very on the edge. But I did that. I got my master's degree in history at Virginia Commonwealth University as well. And then I got a master's degree in history from William and Mary, focusing more on the early republic in 2020. And so now I'm 2/3 of the way through a PhD program, and my dissertation is on Black music culture in the 20th century. So there's a lot going on, honestly.
But you do like Virginia, apparently.
A little bit.
Hey, do you have an exact date for that inventory that was done in April of '65?
Oh, look to the day.
Yeah.
You know what? Not off the top of my head, but the
Okay.
date is written on the back, so I can get back to you.
Yeah.
If there is a specific day, I don't remember there being one, but there could be.
Yeah. And I also wanted to ask you if I could borrow that phrase that you used, hyper focus, because I work at Appomattox Courthouse, the National Park, and we were hyper focused by law. We had an enabling legislation that made us focus specifically and almost to the exclusion of any and everything else on the surrender. And I read tragic accounts of park staff who were interviewing the daughter of a man who had been enslaved in the village. And when freedom came, he bought his own house. He operated a business from the bottom of his house. He became the treasurer for the first black church in the county. He voted in the Constitutional Convention and voted for the first and I think the last black delegate to represent that part of Virginia. And then his family lived there generations, and we have accounts and through descendants of his daughter, learning how to read and write and writing back postcards to folks back at home at the old home place. And these folks from the Park Service were able to interview his daughters in 1952, 54, because they wanted to know about the house where he lived in that was built by a white family. And instead of asking about their dad, John Robinson's experience, they were just like, well, where was the well? How'd you get the water out of the well? Was there a staircase here? So that hyper focus is really unfortunate. And I think, when you're doing work like you're doing, like as a public historian, you get this whole accusation of revisionism, when in reality, the only thing that you're really doing is shining a light that hadn't been shined in a particular corner, or, that wasn't shown the right way. So I think I'd like to borrow that phrase if that's okay.
No, I mean, the intention is to definitely encourage more people to actually focus on the African community African-American community as history makers in and of themselves, as opposed to, here is the person who owned the plantation and everyone who just happened to be peripherally around. And I also think it's an issue with plantation interpretation in general, is that oftentimes you have to focus on the person who is owning the property, and that's pretty much it, instead of looking at it as a site of human history where all of these lives are interacting with each other on equal footing all the time in terms of historical significance.
And that's cumulative too, because just like at Appomattox in the 1960s, the Lynchburg Chamber of Commerce wanted to do a surrender play down there. And they had this synopsis of the plan, and it says right in there that they won't have to deal with the thorny issue of slavery because since April 9th happened, that was all behind them then, you know. So it just, it's gotta stop somewhere. So.
Yeah, and I'm glad that, I like to think that we're leading the charge in that process.
Yeah.
As well as other sites that we're doing the same, like Highlands and others.
So we have plantations here in Lynchburg. One of the big ones was the Scott Plantation, which was basically from Randolph College up to the Trent's Ferry and from Rivermont to the James River. And there's several hundred acres on the other side of the James as well that William Scott owned back in 1786 until he passed away and gave it to his kids. We have his will, and we know the first names of some of those that he enslaved, but it's been really hard. There's a family Bible that apparently has some all those that were enslaved listed in the Bible, but we can't quite get a hold of it. We can get it. There's a kind of a synopsis of it that has one name, and it says we didn't think it was a priority to list all the people that were enslaved, so this is just one name, and this is their birth date. Can you give some insights as to, and we don't have anybody that we know of that is the descendants because we don't have last names. I'm wondering if you have any insights about how to research and find more information on people that lived on the plantation who we only have first names of.
So, well, I guess the first question I would have is how long was the plantation active?
So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure about that. Definitely into the mid-1800s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then what I would recommend doing is starting with property records, property tax records, which would also list oftentimes, and also it does depend on the county and the registrar, which is why there are variations in what records may look like from county to county. But I would start with property tax records first, which should include the names of the enslaved people who were taxable on that property. And it's possible to, so one of the things that I have done that can help, it just depends, is that if you use the surname of the person who owned the property, they can, their children, for example, the enslaved children who were born in the early to mid-19th century, they can be in birth indices with that name or the enslaver's name attached to them, as well as a mortality schedule. Again, property tax record is a good way to do it. And once you've been able to figure out who is enslaved, you can start looking at the census from 1870 and going forward. So it's really just a matter of trying to figure out if you can identify those people in a particular place and time in the mid-19th century and then push them forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just hard from the first name to, after 1870. I'm not sure whether this is the actual person or not.
Yeah, I mean, this would be the way to start unpacking it. So you'd have to go to the courthouse to do it. Birth indices and things like that you can find on Ancestry or Family Search, which is free.
Yeah.
A free website, which I highly recommend, and oftentimes has more information than Ancestry does. So you can start there and also look at your county courthouse as well.
One more question?
Yes.
In the case of the Scott family that he's talking about, there's actually some records of the black people in the St. Stephen's Church Register.
Oh.
There's a book on that, and there's even some in the Funeral Home records
And I photographed all this stuff.
for the slaves.
About the Scott Plantation, I have done considerable research on that. In fact, I just brought over tons and tons of stuff over here, which Deb is aware of.
And Steve is going through
I'm
it.
going through
Okay.
it.
Yeah.
Still, I mean, the names of the enslaved really are defined. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. A work in progress for Jones.
Yeah.
But thank you, Peyton. Wonderful. And I think if you have sort of individual questions, I'm sure Peyton has been very generous with his time and would be happy to speak with you for a little bit afterwards. But thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you here in December for the Travis McDonald book signing, and then back again in March. So thank you.
Susie still in here. I thought, yeah, I read it.